Hi, everyone. All right, so we're going to take a stab at Schelling's philosophical investigations into the essence of human freedom. And as I said in the last video, Schelling's primary agenda uh, is to explain the possibility of human freedom, possibility of good and evil in the context of idealism or in response to German idealism. And he is in particular interested in thinking about going beyond idealism to imagine a living God and a human being whose freedom doesn't come strictly through rationality, but is part of uh, the personality. Um, so I've uh, flagged a number of pages here, and we're going to just sort of look at a couple of different passages from this book and see if we can um, parse out some meaning. So on page 18, he writes, God is not a God of the dead, but of the living. It is not comprehensible how the most perfect being could find pleasure, even in the most perfect machine possible. Right? So, why is God a God of the living, not of the dead? And what does he mean by a God of the dead? Would be the sort of God posited by Spinoza, uh, or any kind of determinism, which would set up nature as a perfect machine, right? In which everything is predetermined. A God which is, as he says elsewhere, merely the best set of laws, or God is simply a set of laws, right? That would be a dead God. Uh, and so it's interesting, right? It's not comprehensible that the most perfect being, and Schelling is here using this definition of God, a classical definition, scholastic definition of God as being a perfect being, uh, saying, right, that perfection has to be more than the mechanical. Uh, right? If nature is mechanical, nature follows necessary laws, um, then this is not um, perfect in the sense that Schelling wants us to think about perfection. Perfection has to be more than a perfect being. I think that's a really kind of beautiful idea, right? We think of perfection sometimes in terms of efficiency, right? The most efficient system is the perfect system. Um, for Schelling, that's not going to be good enough, um, right? Any kind of mechanism is not going to reach the same kind of perfection. He wants not just sort of mechanistic perfection. He wants, again, moral perfection in God. uh, However, one may conceive of the way in which beings proceed from God, the way can never be mechanical, not mere production or installation whereby the product is nothing for itself. Right? Just as little can it be emanation, where what flows out remains the same as that from which it flows. Therefore, nothing individual, nothing independent. Okay, so uh, the first criticism of the mechanical view of nature here uh, is that a machine would produce something that is nothing for itself, right? The machine of nature just reproduces itself. It goes on reproducing itself. Its products are nothing in themselves. They are part of the same machine that produces them, right? If all of nature is simply a machine following a set of rules, it's a machine that produces nothing but itself. And that makes no sense for Schelling. Um, so the mechanical view of nature is inadequate. Uh, just as little can it be emanation, and this is a clear reference to Plotinus, uh, and he makes reference to Plotinus later on, as I mentioned, right? And the problem with emanation is similar to the problem of the machine, uh, right? Emanation, where what flows out remains the same as that from which it flows. In other words, there is no differentiation, right? We remember for Plotinus, uh, the world emanates from God, but the individuation and differentiation within the physical world is only a privation, deterioration of what is in God, of perfection. And so anything with true being um, is identical to God. Um, and therefore, God again produces nothing but himself, right? In the same way the machine produces nothing but itself. Uh, Again, these are different sort of ideas um, of pantheism, of determinism, right? Where everything that is follows necessarily from its cause uh, and there is no separation between cause and effect. What Schelling wants to find is individuation, the individual, and an individual that is independent uh, from God, that is independent in itself, right? That in some sense has its own ground. Um, he says, the same passage in 18, the procession of things from God is a self revelation of God, but God can only reveal himself to himself in what is like him, beings acting of their own accord. So, uh, God reveals himself um, not as himself, right? He reveals himself to himself. It's a very interesting idea, and we'll talk more about that later. Reveals himself to himself, not in what is identical to him, right? Nothing new is learned from mere repetition, um, but reveals himself to himself in what is like him. Right? And what is like God is that which is autonomous, right? That which is individual and independent. So, what is like God? Free beings acting on their own. So, in order for God to reveal himself to himself, uh, that revelation can only occur through the creation of beings that are like God, that resemble God, uh, and the what resembles God, free being acting on its own. He goes on, for whose being there is no ground other than God, but who are as God is. So, uh, this living God, right, is what Schelling is trying to um, explain. And again, he wants to do this in opposition to Spinoza. Uh, on page 20, he says, and here then, once and for all, our definite opinion about Spinocism. This system is not fatalism because it allows things to be contained in God, for, as we've shown, pantheism at least makes formal freedom not impossible. Dot, dot, dot. The error of his system lies by no means in his placing things in God, but in the fact that they are things, uh, right? Spinoza, Leibniz, both of them, right, say all is in God. Uh, but what is it that is in God? What are these bodies? How do we conceive of them? Conceive of them as, we might say, mere things. For Spinoza, attributes of God. For Leibniz, hexades, like puzzle pieces of being, which God has assembled. Um, so the problem with Spinoza and Leibniz, with determinism in general, is that it conceives of beings, beings like us, human beings, but all beings, uh, as merely things. And Schelling will say, is it really correct to understand a human being as a thing? Uh, is it correct to understand any object or body as merely a thing? He goes on, in the abstract concept of beings in the world, indeed of infinite substance itself, which for him is exactly also a thing. Uh, he goes on, he, Spinoza, treats the will also as a thing, right? And then proves very naturally that it would have to be determined in all its activity through another thing that is in turn determined by another, and so on ad infinitum, right? Uh, It is only by conceiving of the beings of the world as mere things that we can posit determinism, right? A thing is that which is entirely passive, right? Has no ground for activity in itself. It is acted upon and it reacts to that which acts upon it. So, in order to have determinism, we have to reduce all beings to their mere thingliness, to make them mere things. He says, hence the lifelessness of his system, the sterility of its form, the poverty of concepts and expressions, the unrelenting severity of definitions that goes together excellently with the abstract means of presentation. Right? So it is a lifeless system that says every existing being is a thing, right? We're all just billiard balls whacking into each other and reacting to each other. And what sets it all in motion is this first cause, but everything thereafter is a thing that is acted upon and reacts. Um, so, uh, and he asks, right? Or does one doubt that the basic views of Spinozism must already be essentially changed by a dynamic notion of nature? Uh, so, sort of side note, one thing that is um, sort of brewing during Schelling's era is a changing concept of nature. Right? Nature is no longer being viewed as a priori static and unchanging, but as dynamic. Right? We're still some 50 years from Darwin's concept of evolution, theory of evolution, but Schelling would have been aware of the writings of someone like Georges Cuvier, who was one of the first thinkers to introduce the idea of extinction, uh, the idea that, you know, over a very long course of natural history, species emerge and go extinct. And so, right, Schelling is introducing this idea of nature that is entirely opposed to Spinoza's concept of it, which is a dynamic nature, a nature that is in flux and changing. Um, this is a living nature, right? Not a system, not a mechanism per se, um, but alive. And he says, one could look at the rigidity of Spinozism as a Pygmalion statue that had to be made animate through the warm breath of love. Right. So, what is it that is going to be the the motivation, the the fire that makes nature dynamic, that makes beings alive rather than mere things? Uh, what will right, turn Spinoza's lifeless system into a dynamic living one? He says, the warm breath of love. Right? Now, uh, and that's on page 21. Uh, so I'm going to pause here, short little video. We've got to get to office hours, but we'll pick this up in just a minute. Okay.